What I liked most about Sell Yourself Like a CEO was just how practical it was. When you shared the book with me, you said it was an easy read, and what I didn't recognize was actually half the book is the work booklet, right? To actually work through some of the exercises that you challenge us to the reader to go through. And so that made it, quite an easy read. And what I loved about it was, I think some of your chapters, people dedicate entire books to some sections of your chapters, and you condensed a lot of great ideas into one place. So I loved how practical it was, but also how accessible the information was. It wasn't hidden within a lot of extraneous verbiage. It was pretty much, here it is. Here are some stories to really understand it, but it was very, very succinct. And that ties with my last point, which was, I also love that how well it connected elements that are disparate kind of concepts, right? So I think there were elements that you shared, for example, around authenticity, around finding your purpose, even how you structure your approach to negotiating a salary. Their entire books, their entire thoughts that go into that others have published on, but they're all disparate. They're all kind of individual skill sets, whereas this to me was presented in a way that kind of formed its own story, right? It was in a progression that made sense, so that you had a important foundational element to how you kind of sell yourself as a CEO or think with a CEO mindset, which I think is what I kind of read as the underlying message behind the book. And then from there, you built, whether it's negotiating into a new role, whether it's taking on a new role, whether it's working through difficult circumstances, there was something for everything. So love that you were able to bring across all those different concepts into one place, but also stitch it together in a way. It wasn't necessarily a bunch of different ideas just slammed together. It was actually progressive in its thinking, so that it connected into a philosophy that showed you that all these skills aren't disparate skills that just random. They actually reinforce each other. They're behaviors or mindsets that once you build in one area, it helps in another area. And I think that to me was a really useful component of the book that helped. I hope will help many readers understand that the growth isn't just in one particular domain and then now you're so much better. Yes, work on one area and that's important, but working on that one area will benefit other areas as well.
Awesome. Thank you. What do you think is the biggest misconception people have about selling themselves, and how does this book challenge that?
I think the biggest misconception people have about selling themselves is literally that. They think it's about advertising, talking themselves up, showboating, right? Becoming extremely, you get concepts of people thinking they have to be overly extroverted, right, in order to put themselves out there. And obviously, if you're introverted, that becomes alarmingly impossible and really stressful. And it also becomes, very disingenuous, right? And I think that's something you harped on a lot. And again, this progression comes in where you talk about authenticity and understanding what your purpose is and what your drive is in the next year, 5 years, longer term. It's all connected to that. So I think the biggest, misconception I see is people think they have to be something that they're not. And I think you talked about that very clearly, that that's something you've seen, as you talk to people who are struggling around, making themselves noticed. So I think the book addresses that really well because it harps on, first and foremost, something around authenticity, which I think is really important. But bigger than that, it talks about how it's not about necessarily being the loudest person in the room, right? It's not necessarily about being the most noticed. It's about being true to what you believe in and sharing that authentically with passion. And it doesn't have to be with everyone in the world, right? It just needs to be with people maybe or within your own teams. I myself have been on journeys where I've done that a lot through, LinkedIn, for example, not to advertise, but to literally connect with other people who are like-minded, who also agree with similar principles, or who also agree with the opportunity that exists before us in our given industry. So I think that's the biggest misconception that I see when I talk to a lot of people is they say, oh, I don't like, speaking up about myself. I said, don't speak about, how good you are. Speak about what you're passionate about, and how good you are at it will come naturally through the passion you describe for it. And I think you did a really wonderful job highlighting that, because that's one of the biggest things that I've noticed, particularly with younger, people in the younger phases of their career. They look up to certain people and go, well, I have to be that. And one of the best pieces of advice I got very early in my career was, the best thing a manager can do is make opportunities for an individual who's got aspirations to lead to be exposed to different styles, because ultimately you don't become a great leader by emulating someone else, even if it's someone you respect. You become a great leader by understanding what they do and the behaviors they do, why they're important, but picking and choosing what resonates with your values and resonates with how you want to live as a person, how you want to make a difference in the world. So connecting that with your why, connecting that with your behavior and values is uniquely you. So, and then again, we come back to authenticity, right? So I think sharing that passion at that level becomes incredibly important, because otherwise it's not genuine. You're trying to be something you're not. And it's pretty easy for people to see through that and see that something's, superficial and not genuine.
What's the number one piece of advice from the book that you wish you had known earlier in your career?
Yeah, that's a good question. What's the number one piece of advice from the book? There's so many. For me, there were a lot of really good reminders. I think, I've certainly in my career come to recognize the importance of your why, come to recognize the importance of authenticity. I think and I said this earlier, what I think really resonated with me, and this is what I perhaps would have liked to have heard a lot earlier in my career, is it doesn't all need to happen overnight. And it doesn't need to happen in one hit. It's not something that's people are born with. It's not something you have to do immediately just because you recognize it. It's a journey. And I think, especially when I was younger and perhaps more ambitious, I always felt like, hey, there's something more I need to do, and I need to be that person or that role. These days, I think a lot less about that and think more about the value I'm creating, or the legacy I'm creating, or how I'm entertaining my passion, or how I'm making a difference to others. And you find that once you start focusing on that, the rest kind of follows with it. So I think you did a great job in the book, I thought, Ryan, of connecting those elements together and helping, recognize that once you can figure out a little bit more about the direction you're going, it doesn't need to be perfect, right? It just needs to be, well, this is what I see now. You create experiences for yourself that test that, almost like a hypothesis, to go, well, I think I want to do this, and this is how I want to do my value, so I'm going to head in that direction. But as you do, you learn. Maybe there are elements of that you don't like, or elements of that don't resonate with your values. Or better still, you get exposed to newer things and go, oh, wow, I didn't know that existed. I wish I could add value in that area. And then, I'm a huge believer in a non-linear career path, where the journey is possibly more important than the destination in many respects. And to me, that's a big part of what you share in the book, is simplifying what is very daunting, right? You tell someone early in their career, it doesn't need to be a straight line. There's comfort in that, but it's also extremely overwhelming, because now there's a limitless set of possibilities, and there's no clear kind of itinerary of how to get to where they think they need to get to. And I think that's where the advice in your book helps distill that into something that's, like I said earlier, practical. So you can get moving as opposed to getting lost in philosophy or getting lost in theory. You kind of say, here's some simple steps to just get started on the path, and the rest you'll figure out once you start the journey. And I think that's a big thing that I wish I'd heard a lot more when I was younger, was the destination isn't so important, but also it's just about getting started, because as you do, you will learn.
Yeah. Gold. Thank you. Now, you're a polished, accomplished, seasoned executive. But is there any fear or challenge that you feel more confident about tackling now, having read the book?
Definitely. You know, I'm facing a bit of a transition myself at the moment, as you know, and I think what the book really helped me better clarify in my own mind. And remember, there's a whole chapter on clarity, right? That was one of my favorites. What it helped me understand was, you know, the situation I'm in now, where I'm thinking about what's next for myself. It's actually a really good opportunity. It helped remind me that, you know, this is advice I give to many other people. It's healthy to kind of rethink your values and not rethink your values, but rethink where you are against your values. Rethink about what you want to do next. There were some deliberately practical exercises that I undertook in the book, because it helped me frame up and crystallize how I want to approach my next approach, how I want to think about the sorts of things that I enjoy doing, the sorts of areas where I think I can add value, but also to think about what I haven't done yet, also to think about what I, haven't tried. And I think the biggest one for me, even though, I would say the book title is a little bit of a misnomer, right? Because it sells itself like a CEO, but it's not necessarily just to be a CEO. It's that mindset that applies to any leadership, lower level, top of the rung in any industry. And I think that's the key thing, is to it reminded me to think about those elements. But it also reminded me to not limit myself either. For a long time, I've also, I've been happy kind of saying, well, I can stay in this space. I love pushing these areas, but there's definitely things that I've gone, I don't know if I'd ever be able to do that. And a good example is being a CEO. And I would say I don't have, the experience to say on the financials, or, any experience talking to investors or shareholders. So, I always looked at that as something like, well, I don't have that experience. So, I'm not kind of ready for that. But the book helped, the exercises in the book in particular, help break that down to a point where you go, well, when you actually identify what it is that you have as a gap, it's actually in your mind conceptually a lot bigger than it really is. And then you can actually see with clarity what it is that you want to develop skills in and build a path to it. And so that's one thing that I'm going to be trying to do, particularly this year, is to kind of put myself in a situation where, how can I learn those skills I don't have, to see if I can A, learn them, but B, also see if that removes some of the, maybe psychological limitations I've put on my own potential, just because I, just haven't had that experience. You've helped kind of reaffirm that it's actually not hard to think about the specific experience that's required, and then build a plan, right, to actually get that experience.
Wonderful. And of course, you're from Australia, but you've interacted with people all around Asia. And most recently, you've been general manager in Japan. And Japan is its own market in the sense that it's got an unprecedented aging population, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the folks who are leading teams are at or near retirement age. And there's quite a thin layer to that next band. So really, a core trigger of writing this book is to empower that next generation. But I'm curious, first of all, what differences have you seen, if any, in terms of how candidates show up in interviews between Japan and Australia or other countries, for example? Any cultural differences there, and any advice you have to Japanese candidates to to stand out in interviews?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question, Ryan. So yeah, the differences between I've seen many differences between different cultures and how they present themselves in interviews or as candidates. I would say in Japan in general, a lot of folk are quite reserved, right? So going back to that concept that you talk a lot about in the book, which is advertising yourself. There's not a lot of self promotion, right? And so I think people, I get the impression that a lot of candidates are afraid of coming across as arrogant or rude by talking about themselves in a certain way. Um, and I've noticed that in particular with female candidates, which is a real shame because there's a lot of great experiences they've done, but they're a little bit hesitantness, to kind of share, some of the experiences they've had or the skill sets they have in a positive light. So that's number one. The other thing is a lot of Japanese, and I completely empathize with this. A lot of Japanese candidates are not so confident, with their English. No matter how many times I tell them your English is a million times better than my Japanese, um, there's a fear that they may not come across exactly as intended, or may come across rude, or may come across without full intention. And key piece of advice is you're actually more on message than you probably think. Um, Even if it's not polished, even if it's rough, uh, the exact wording is not so important. The key message you're trying to get across is almost always there. And that's what employers are looking for, is just looking for evidence of how you think, of how you approach problems, how you approach challenges, how you approach opportunities, how you approach your fellow workmates. These are all critical in the modern workplace. And particularly even in Japan, where most people, I think, would prefer to continue to have conversations in Japanese with their colleagues. Even Japan is increasingly becoming an international business. Um, yes, Japan is literally and figuratively sometimes an island, but in the business context, and particularly in life sciences and healthcare, it's increasingly becoming important for the business in Japan to be connected with the rest of the world.
Beautiful. So just be confident and reiterating how Japan is really part of the global stage. So don't worry about the syntax. Uh,
Exactly.
just get your message out.
Exactly. Get your message out. Um, and I mean, I'm seeing it more, especially from, like you said, that middle band. I've had the pleasure of meeting a number of candidates who are showing passion. That's the other thing, right? Some of the older generation leaders that I talk to, there's less emotion. It's more about factual, elements of previous experiences.
Yeah.
I'm seeing the younger generation now coming through, much more of that emotion. You start seeing the excitement of something they did. And this is where, as a recruiter, you'll be familiar with the STAR methodology, which you talk a lot about in the book.
Yes.
I love that as well because, it's impossible to bullshit through STAR because you have to talk about a real experience and talk about how it connects with, what you were trying to achieve. So I love those, but what I'm noticing is it also gives an opportunity for the individual to share their emotion. Maybe sometimes it's a frustration if it was a difficult situation, or it's excitement if they were able to overcome a certain challenge. But that emotion starting to flow through, it's great to see that because it's showing that the individuals are connecting with their work. They're connecting with their colleagues and their co-workers. They're connecting with their customers and their clients. So seeing that emotional passion is something I'm noticing a lot with the younger generation that I do speak to, or candidates I speak to. And that's really exciting, I think. I think it's really a good sign, because that's exactly how I see people in the workplace once they're on. But that whole, I need to be, stone-faced and completely regimented regimented in an interview. I'm starting to see that impression get shattered a little bit, which is great, because then you're starting to see people for what they really are when they would join you. Yeah.
Awesome, man. Thank you. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
Um, there was one thing I was gonna. I had this one little thing that I wanted to make sure I mentioned, or weave into a question. Can't remember if I included it. I think for me, again, congratulations on a fantastic book. Even your process of how you put it together was intriguing in itself. And it's actually inspired me to think about my own, I guess, authorship, because there's been a few articles I've written over time. There's a few ideas that I've always wondered how to convert it into something that's more accessible for others. And I think you've definitely given me some personal inspiration of how to achieve that in how you wrote the book. I will say this, right? I think I wish more leadership books, business books, titles around self-discovery and growth were written in a similar format, because it is so much more accessible. And I don't really think you lose any of the advantages by kind of trimming it down to the core essentials, the core principles. Like I said, you had plenty of examples and stories that really help make the message resonate. But you weren't spending weeks trying to troll through the book to try and extract that information and that soundbite. And frankly, titles like this end up being more like references. As I said, in your lifetime, in your career, you face different challenges. So being able to come to a book like what you've written and go, oh, actually, it's time to look for a new job. I'm going to look at that particular thing around the interviews, or I'm going to look at that particular section that Ryan wrote around negotiating, your package. Those are only relevant in certain times of your career, but being able to actually access that quite easily, both the written content as well as the workbook, I think it makes it so much more, as I said earlier, practical to apply, rather than going, okay, where in this 300-page volume did Ryan talk about X, Y, Z? And this is why people end up writing cliff notes and summaries of these books, right? Because it makes it more accessible. You immediately made it more accessible for people to get that information. Like I said, that's usually in other places. And you found that thread to string it together based on your own experiences and observations of many, many years with, fantastic leaders. So again, huge congratulations for how you put the book together and how you presented it to the readers.
Thank you. And that's why it was formatted in that way, because there's this e-learning industry that's growing exponentially, and we see all the advertisements for micro learning, right?
Yep.
Being able to get knowledge in really bite-sized, accessible format. There's companies like Headway and Blinkist and many others. So why not put this into a similar format, but for in a book? So thank you for sharing that. Are there any questions that you have for me while we're on the call that I can answer for you?
Yeah, I mean, for me, there's a lot, and I think I'm still processing it, because I'm being completely honest, right? Because I've been working on a LinkedIn article, actually it's probably a couple of years now, and it's got to the point where I've been blowing it out, and my wife was editing it, because she's an editor. She's been playing around and she goes, "This is way too long. Like, you need to do something different with this format." And I've been struggling, because I'm like, I can't write a book on this because it's not big enough for a book. And then I saw what you wrote, and I went, maybe it is possible, right? Because again, mine was more about organizational. It brings together elements of what I did in my operations career as well as my management career around solving, organizational challenges. And I've got a kind of a methodology I've put together that I was hoping to test out, but I haven't kind of got to that point yet. So I'll have loads of questions around like just how I know you used a lot of, ChatGPT and prompting and things like that to kind of help put things together, but just your process. I'd probably love to pick your brain at some point in the future, if you don't mind, to understand if a similar process might help me, or I need to look at it in a different light. But the end result of what you got to is certainly something that I see more as a format, right? Of like where I think we can head, something that's much more practically orientated that people can then immediately kind of implement. So yeah.
Yeah, there's a principle that I learned from the book called Buy Back Your Time that helped me to take this from a concept into a product. And that was the 10-80-10 principle, which is a very fundamental and commonly known principle, but I learned it in the book Buy Back Your Time. And that is 10% ideation. So get your idea out there, right? And you, like me, we're both, talking and communicating verbally comes very naturally to us. So to leverage that strength, get it out there somehow, even record it, into a mic, into so you can then transcribe it. To just get it all out. Freestyle, free flow thinking, and stories, examples, reference, everything that comes up to mind, just dumping that out. But then 90% or the 80% then is having someone or something to refine that. Right. And ChatGPT is great because it's essentially a virtual ghostwriter. Right. Mm-hmm. And it can, by looking at a transcript of what we say as a speaker, it can understand our tone. It can store those examples in memory, those reference points, the underlying concepts, the nuances, and all those things, as well as the substance itself. And then we can kind of puppeteer ChatGPT or whatever software we're using to mold it into the end result. So just like a leader says, this is the vision, team, make this happen. And then the team brings you back in to say, this is what we have. What do you think? And a couple tweaks and hones here and there. And then you got the final product. So just like a CEO delegates ideas and visions to have their team execute it, it's really the same kind of mindset that I went into this process with. And that's what came out of it. Of course, it wasn't just one, it wasn't done in just one brain dump and then one hone. I honed it over a couple of months and, to a borderline obsessive compulsive degree because, I wanted to get it right. And I wanted to know that this was authentic, that I could honestly say to someone, yes, I use ChatGPT, but I'm 100% comfortable with that because this is the process that I took. And although I'm not promoting it yet, the original work, the original course, so that original one take output, verbal output, is available in a course at ryan-sheppard.com for anyone who is interested.
Oh, cool.
And it's based on this original framework that I thought of one day after I saw in a session called CPath, C-path. And that stands for chart your path. So it's the vision, where you want to go, the values, all that kind of stuff, and mapping your journey from here to there, skill gaps, etc. Then P is personal branding, how to get that CV looking good to be noticed by the right people, not just look nice, but noticed by the right people, right? Have those right keywords and copywriting in there, the right verbiage. And then A is attracting opportunities, interview preparation essentially, but also how to negotiate your salary, resign smoothly. Transition is for time management, which is a big thing for any CEO, right? We all have the same number of hours in the week, but it's how we use those hours that determines the value that we create. And then finally, H, hedge your move, which is in the 8th chapter of the book, hedging your move. It's hedging your move, it's same concept as the first 90 days by Michael Watkins, but kind of my own perspective on it.
Yeah, because I have gone through that as well. I have a different analogy for you. Just bear with me for a second. But for anyone who's done sales, right? So Miller Hyman is famous, right, as a methodology.
Yeah.
But the reality is it's not practical to do that routinely, it is actually quite complicated. Like those blue sheets are pretty insane. So it's a really good learning path to kind of think about different things, but on a routine basis doesn't become practical. I think that's one thing you did a really good job in the book was there's many situations where you have these really detailed guides that go through in quite a lot of minutia, right? How to handle every kind of possibility and situation. And it controls almost everything to bring it down to like a template, right? But the challenge with that is it becomes extremely difficult to remember it as a principle or to think about it in broader terms on a day-to-day basis. And that's where like the first 90 days for me was, yeah, this is pretty good, but it's almost too much, as opposed to kind of you get lost in the details. I guess what I'm trying to say, as opposed to the key principles. Like, let's face it, you don't have hours a day to kind of follow the book bit by bit.
Yeah.
But you also don't want to forget about the core elements that are really trying to achieve there. And I think that's something that you did well, was by focusing on those core elements. It not only gives flexibility for your style and different approaches, but it helps people helps remind people on what's the most important thing you're trying to achieve here, or what you're trying to do, as opposed to getting lost in the exact 15-step process that might be necessary.